I. "That Arab's gun never went off, only he went up 2 feet or more into the air and fell backwards, shot through the head, which was the part of his person that I had covered." The hunters uttered a low "Ow" of approval, while Stephen, in a sort of ecstasy, exclaimed, "Oh, what a heavenly shot!" "Not bad, but I shouldn't have fired it," I answered, "for they haven't attacked us yet. It is a kind of declaration of war, and," I added, as Stephen's sun helmet leapt up from his head, "there's the answer. Down, all of you, and fire through the loopholes." Then the fight began. Except for its grand finale, it wasn't really much of a fight when compared with one or two we had afterwards on this expedition. But, on the other hand, its character was extremely awkward for us. The Arabs made one rush at the beginning, shouting on Allah as they came. But though they were plucky villains, they did not repeat that experiment. Either by good luck or good management, Stephen knocked over 2 of them with his double-barrelled rifle, and I also emptied my large bore breech loader, the first I ever owned, among them, not without results, while the hunters made a hit or 2. After this the Arabs took cover, getting behind trees and, as I had feared, hiding in the reeds on the banks of the stream. Thence they harassed us a great deal, for amongst them were some very decent shots. Indeed, had we not taken the precaution of lining the thorn fence with a thick bank of earth and sods, we should have fared badly. As it was, one of the hunters was killed, the bullet passing through the loophole and striking him in the throat as he was about to fire, while the unfortunate bearers who were on rather higher ground suffered a good deal, 2 of them being dispatched outright and 4 wounded. After this I made the rest of them lie flat on the ground close against the fence, in such a fashion that we could fire over their bodies. Soon it became evident that there were more of these Arabs than we had thought, for quite 50 of them were firing from different places. Moreover, by slow degrees they were advancing with the evident object of outflanking us and gaining the high ground behind. Some of them, of course, we stopped as they rushed from cover to cover, but this kind of shooting was as difficult as that at bolting rabbits across a woodland ride, and to be honest, I must say that I alone was much good at the game, for here my quick eye and long practice told. Within an hour the position had grown very serious indeed, so much so that we found it necessary to consider what should be done. I pointed out that with our small number a charge against the scattered riflemen who were gradually surrounding us would be worse than useless, while it was almost hopeless to expect to hold the boma till nightfall. Once the Arabs got behind us they could rake us from the higher ground. Indeed, for the last half hour we had directed all our efforts to preventing them from passing this boma, which fortunately the stream on the one side and a stretch of quite open land on the other made it very difficult for them to do without more loss than they cared to face. "I fear there is only one thing for it," I said at length, during a pause in the attack while the Arabs were either taking counsel or waiting for more ammunition, "to abandon the camp and everything and bolt up the hill. As those fellows must be tired, and we are all good runners, we may save our lives in that way." "How about the wounded?" asked Stephen, "and the slave woman and child?" "I don't know," I answered, looking down. Of course I did know very well, but here in an acute form arose the ancient question: were we to perish for the sake of certain individuals in whom we had no great interest, and whom we could not save by remaining with them? If we stayed where we were our end seemed fairly certain, whereas if we ran for it we had a good chance of escape. But this involved the desertion of several injured bearers and a woman and child whom we had picked up starving, all of whom would certainly be massacred, save perhaps the woman and child. As these reflections flitted through my brain, I remembered that a drunken Frenchman named Leblanc, whom I had known in my youth and who had been a friend of Napoleon, or so he said, told me that the great Emperor, when he was besieging Acre in the Holy Land, was forced to retreat. Being unable to carry off his wounded men, he left them in a monastery on Mount Carmel, each with a dose of poison by his side. Apparently they did not take the poison, for according to Leblanc, who said he was present there, not as a wounded man, the Turks came and butchered them. So Napoleon chose to save his own life and that of his army at the expense of his wounded. But after all, I reflected, he was no shining example to Christian men, and I hadn't time to find any poison. In a few words I explained the situation to Mavovo, leaving out the story of Napoleon, and asked his advice. "We must run," he answered. "Although I do not like running, life is more than stores, and he who lives may one day pay his debts." But the wounded, Mavovo, we cannot carry them." "I will see to them, Macumazahn. It is the fortune of war. Or if they prefer it we can leave them, to be nursed by the Arabs." Which of course was just Napoleon and his poison over again. I confess that I was about to assent, not wishing that I and Stephen, especially Stephen, should be potted in an obscure engagement with some miserable slave traders, when something happened. It will be remembered that shortly after dawn Hans, using a shirt for a flag, had led the fugitive slaves past the camp up to the hill behind. There he and they had vanished, and from that moment to this we had seen nothing of him or them. Now of a sudden he reappeared, still waving the shirt. After him rushed a great mob of naked men, 200 of them perhaps, brandishing slave sticks, stones, and the boughs of trees. When they had almost reached the boma whence we watched them amazed, they split into two bodies, half of them passing to our left, apparently under the command of the Mazitu who had accompanied Hans to the slave camp, and the other half to the right, following the old Hottentot himself. I stared at Mavovo, for I was too thunderstruck to speak. "Ah!" said Mavovo, "that spotted snake of yours," he referred to Hans, "is great in his own way, for he has been able to put courage into the hearts of slaves. Do you not understand, my father, that they are about to attack those Arabs, yes, and to pull them down as wild dogs do a buffalo calf?" It was true. This was the Hottentot's superb design. Moreover, it succeeded. Up on the hillside he had watched the progress of the fight and seen how it must end. Then, through the interpreter who was with them, he harangued those slaves, pointing out to them that we, their white friends, were about to be overwhelmed, and that they must either strike for themselves or return to the yoke. Among them were some who had been warriors in their own tribes, and through these he stirred the others. They seized the slave sticks from which they had been freed, pieces of rock, anything that came to their hands, and at a given signal charged, leaving only the women and children behind them. Seeing them come, the scattered Arabs began to fire at them, killing some, and thereby revealing their own hiding places. At these the slaves rushed. They hurled themselves upon the Arabs. They tore them, they dashed out their brains in such fashion that within another 5 minutes quite 2/3 of them were dead, and the rest, of whom we took some toll with our rifles as they bolted from cover, were in full flight. It was a terrible vengeance. Never did I witness a more savage scene than that of these outraged men wreaking their wrongs upon their tormentors. I remember that when most of the Arabs had been killed and a few were escaped, the slaves found one, I think it was the captain of the gang, who had hidden himself in a little patch of dead reeds washed up by the stream. Somehow they managed to fire these. I expect that Hans, who had remained discreetly in the background after the fighting began, emerged when it was over and gave them a match. In due course out came the wretched Arab. Then they flung themselves on him as marching ants do upon a caterpillar, and despite his cries for mercy, tore him to fragments, literally to fragments. Being what they were, it was hard to blame them. If we had seen our parents shot, our infants pitilessly butchered, our homes destroyed, and our women and children marched off in the slave sticks to be sold into bondage, should we not have done the same? I think so, although we are not ignorant savages. Thus our lives were saved by those whom we had tried to save, and for once justice was done even in those dark parts of Africa, for in that time they were dark indeed. Had it not been for Hans and the courage which he managed to inspire into the hearts of these crushed blacks, I have little doubt but that before nightfall we should have been dead, for I do not think that any attempt at retreat would have proved successful. And if it had, what would have happened to us in that wild country, surrounded by enemies, and with only a few rounds of ammunition that we could have carried in our flight? "Ah, Baas," said the Hottentot a little while later, squinting at me with his bead-like eyes, "after all you did well to listen to my prayer and bring me with you. Old Hans is a drunkard, yes, or at least he used to be, and old Hand gambles, yes, and perhaps old Hans will go to hell. But meanwhile old Hans can think, as he thought one day before the attack at Maraisfontein. as he thought one day on the Hill of Slaughter by Dingaan's kraal.